Welcome back, everyone. Hope you've been enjoying your somewhat lighter reading load for the last week or so, a couple of weeks, and going deeper with the article. I'm going to share just a little bit with you now about the nature of what it means to be theologians in the context of what we do as counsellors and spiritual carers. And those who employ, those of us who are counsellors who employ spiritual care approaches, and indeed those of us who are spiritual carers who employ counselling approaches, we're all, in that sense, on the boundary line in many ways in what we do. But how we as counsellors and spiritual carers employ theology, and how we become theologians in the sense of understanding the intersection of mystery and knowledge, the intersection of scripture and of tradition with our day-to-day experiences of human beings. So that's what we're going to explore together for a little while. Today I was hoping to get out amongst the animals or on the farm or in some kind of interesting context for you today, but it's very cold outside here in Nilma North in Gippsland, envying those northerners amongst us today. The sun is shining, but it's a cold day outside. So here we are, tucked away in my little corner of the house, to share together what it means to do theology and be theologians in the context of spiritual care. Where does our theology come from? Perhaps that's a question we can start with. And those of us who are not particularly au fait with doing theology or being theologians, your particular voice in this, as we share together in conversation on Wednesday, will be important. So I'm looking forward to your feedback in terms of what I share with you today. Traditionally, our theological thinking comes from four broadly defined places. And I'll actually, before I jump into those four broadly defined places, I'll simply say this. When we come to university to do theology, we don't, contrary to somewhat popular opinion, learn what to think. In fact, we focus our attention more on how to think in terms of doing theology. We're about asking ourselves, how do I find my own voice in the conversation that we call theology? And so I hope you're not expecting me to tell you exactly where to go in the Bible or exactly what to think in terms of who God is or who God isn't in relation to ageing and our care of people who are ageing, in the sense of spirituality and spiritual care. Rather, I want to invite you to consider ways of thinking, how we approach our thought processes and our conversations, not what to think and what particular approach to take. So I'm putting it back on you in a sense, and those of us who love the traditions of Jesus of Nazareth will of course recognise this approach in Jesus himself, who more often than not, when asked a question, would reply to that question with a question that really invited the person to examine themselves and their own inner lives and their own responses to human beings around them. So that's the approach today. And I want us to begin by examining these four broad sources, we call them, for theology. And they cover a pretty wide territory. They are context. So when I say context, I mean the immediate situation that you find yourself in. And that can range from your cultural situation, your sociological situation. It can be your immediate family situation. It can get down right to the micro situation in terms of what's happening right now in the interpersonal encounter as you listen and as you approach the other. So context is in fact a source for theology, and you might find it interesting that I start there. You might have thought that I would start in other places when we talk about theology, but human experience is really, in a sense, the thing that is most present to us as we ask the ultimate questions, the questions of meaning, the questions of God, the questions of what it means to be a human person in the world, and so on. So context is our first source. The other three sources will be more familiar to you. Sacred text, or in the Christian tradition, we simply refer to that as the Bible. We go to the Hebrew Bible, sometimes known as the Old Testament, and the Christian New Testament as authoritative texts in our inquiry when it comes to what we think about human beings, what we think about the processes, and so on. And so we bring sacred text into conversation with context, with our experience, our situation. And we afford both of these sources authority as we inquire about what we think in terms of God and our experience. So context and sacred text. And of course I use the term sacred text specifically because not everyone in our classes are Christians. Some come from other religious traditions and have their own sacred texts, and indeed some who come to our classes don't have any religious tradition at all, and indeed often people with no religious tradition and who have no religious worldview also have sacred texts in terms of ancient Greek philosophy and all kinds of other authoritative texts that help to form their views and so on. So sacred text. The third broadly defined context that we use to construct our theological perspective would be easily called tradition. And this really is the story of human thinking, human theological thinking. And we can bring our church traditions, ranging from our creedal statements and so on, all the way through to our various theological conversations that have taken place over centuries that define what we think and how we approach certain questions that have come to us. So we can draw on our traditions, but not only our thinking traditions and our written traditions, also our traditions of practice, the way we have practiced ritual, for example, in response to various experiences in life, can be part of our tradition. So we might talk of a traditional funeral, for example. And when we're thinking through the theology of what it means to offer a funeral ritual, we can think through and draw on our traditions, what we've always done, the approaches that we've taken in the past, and we can bring those into conversation with ways that we might reconsider offering a funeral, for example, on the basis of who the person is, who we know them to have been, how their family are responding to grief, and so on. So you can see how traditional approaches can be brought into conversation with immediate context and indeed sacred text. The last one that I want to share with you, the fourth broadly defined source for theology, we simply call reason. And by that, I mean all of the ways that we employ as human organisms, as human beings, to grasp, understand, and shape the world, our environment. And that includes, of course, analytical thinking, but it doesn't only include those things. It includes reason, includes all of our creative responses to the world, our intuitive perceptions and understandings of the world around us, how we understand it, but also how we shape it and change it in order to be living, thriving, creative communities together. So we have four broadly defined sources for our theological conversation: context, sacred text, tradition, and reason. And throughout the history of theological thinking and conversation, various different people have put their emphasis on different ones of those. Some spend most of their time reading the sacred texts and drawing insight from the sacred texts, and their focus is on the sacred text. And whilst they do bring it into conversation with context and reason and tradition, their primary interest is in what the sacred text is saying. Others do the same for tradition, studying the creeds or studying the traditions of ritual and worship and so on. And others have a primary focus on reason. As spiritual carers and as counsellors, if we are going to bring theological thinking into our practice, we traditionally primarily employ a contextual approach. So for us, it is really, really important in the way we think about God and mystery and our experience of the world, that we bring our experience of the other human person and our encounter with them in deep listening as a primary source into what we think. One interesting way of thinking about this is something that I often say in class, and that is that in our line of work, our own understanding of the world is often exploded by an encounter with an irreducible mystery. There is nothing quite like an encounter with a human person for the explosion of my precious theories about the world and what it means to live as part of it. In fact, all living organisms resist our reductionist thought experiments with regards to meaning, their meaning, purpose, and value. So what I'm saying there is that whilst I might have a particular understanding of God and human beings and the world and how all of that operates and what's right and what's wrong, and I've got a fairly comfortable understanding of that, when I actually encounter a human being with different experiences and different views and different levels of suffering and approaches to relationship and so on, my understandings of God and the world are invariably challenged, and in some cases challenged so strongly that they are changed and deconstructed and reconstructed with new meaning and new approach. And so as practical theologians, as contextual theologians, those of us who listen to others take those encounters with other human beings and with the world very, very seriously. We afford them a high level of authority in the theological conversation. And so we come to this as contextual, as practical theologians. And once again, that doesn't mean that we don't employ the other sources, because we bring our experiences of people and the world into conversation with the sacred text that we give authority to, with our traditions, and with our processes of reasoning and thinking through things and responding in ways that help us to shape and grasp the world creatively. So I make this claim that we are contextual theologians on the basis of my love for the approach of one of the last great systematic theologians, Paul Tillich. Systematic theologians used to put a lot of emphasis on tradition and reason, and bring those into conversation with context. Paul Tillich was one of the last great systematicians, and it was implicit in his systematic theology, his systematic approach to theology, that the end of systematics was approaching. It was quite liberating for me to read the theology of Paul Tillich, and I recommend to you that you read it also. Perhaps a good place to start with Paul Tillich would be with his little book called The Dynamics of Faith. It's a very short book, very small book, but it sets up for us an approach to faith and the exploration of theological thinking that is really, really helpful when we're listening to other people all of the time. So I found reading Paul Tillich very liberating, because he actually taught me that we could do theology without systematics, without trying to answer everything for everyone all of the time, but that in fact we could do theology in response to the immediate situation. Paul Tillich defined theology as a mediating discipline. A mediating discipline. Let me quote him for you, and it may help you to understand what he meant by that. He wrote, "The task of theology is mediation, mediating between the eternal criterion of truth, as it is manifest in the picture of Jesus as the Christ, and the changing experiences of individuals and groups, their varying questions and their categories of perceiving reality." The term theology implies as such a mediation, namely between the mystery, which is theos, which simply means God, and the understanding, which is logos. Logos was an old ancient Greek word that referred to the rational structure of the cosmos. In other words, the rational structure of everything, that which is implicit in everything that makes it understandable to us. So hence knowledge. And Tillich sees the discipline of theological thinking and conversation as a mediation between mystery, God. The name God is a symbol, of course, for that which is irreducible, and knowledge, that which we can understand, which we can grasp with our rational senses. Before you assume what is meant by mystery here and accuse me of too quickly resorting to mysticism, in other words, we can't know God, I'll clarify the term as I think Paul Tillich meant it, and as has been more recently articulated in the thought of one of our great philosophers, Raymond Gaita. Mystery is not the experience of strangeness and unknowability, if unknowability is a word, which I don't think it is. Mystery is the perception that what is real in experience is irreducible. So, for example, if you are asking what a real human being is, you will soon discover that a human being is not reducible to the sum of its material parts, nor is it reducible to its social value or its usefulness, nor is it reducible to its religious worldview, its hope for a transcendent future. A human being, when you try and reduce it to this or to that, always seems to avoid our grasp. It is irreducible, and therefore it is a mystery. We can only encounter it as a whole living phenomenon. We can't reduce it to this or to that if we try and define it as such. Thus, in this view, theology is a conversation between that which is supposedly reducible in reality, logos, and that which is irreducible in reality, theos. In other words, there are certain things we can know about human beings. We know that they are made up of a lot of water, that they have nervous systems, bones, muscles, that their brains interact in complex ways with all of these systems in order to maintain this kind of living organism that is able to respond to and react to and shape its environment and experiences. We can know all of those things about ourselves. But if we try and reduce ourselves to those things, we realise that we've lost what it means to be human. And so theology brings what we know about ourselves into conversation with what is irreducible about ourselves. And so we do theology when we think about ourselves in these ways. The conversation between theos and logos, mystery and understanding, that which is reducible and that which is irreducible, is inherent in every living phenomenon, every real phenomenon. It is this perception of reality that enables us to be theologians in the world today. It is the element of irreducibility in every phenomenon that is the catalyst for inquiry. So in other words, when you sit down with the aged person or the ageing person and you begin to reflect on your experience with them, it is the irreducible element in that encounter, that which you can't reduce to knowing this or that about them, that causes you to question, to begin to question. And that's the beginning of theological inquiry and thought. So the invitation to you in this today is to see yourselves not only as practical listeners who are able to respond with a toolkit of what to do when a person presents with anxiety or with uncertainty or with fear about going to hospital. It's not just about what to do. You are also invited to be theologians in the sense that you allow this human reality in front of you with all of their unique experiences and responses to the world to cause you to question, to ask what it means not only to be in an encounter with this person, but also what this encounter means about the world, and what does it mean about the nature of human interaction itself, how we all can learn to listen to one another more deeply and with more presence and with more grounded love and openness to one another on the basis of what I've experienced here. So you bring your encounter, your experience, into constant conversation with reflection on that experience. And this little process it's a circular process: action, reflection, experience, reflection, encounter, reflection. It's known as praxis, Praxis, and it is a dynamic process of interaction with the world that we know to be theology. So it's the element of irreducibility in every phenomenon that is the catalyst for inquiry. Just when we think we understand, just when we think we may have nailed something down on the basis of its value to society or its functional usefulness or its capacity to get better or be happy, we discover that it escapes our reductionist grasp. I remember one person saying to me, I do this counselling and spiritual care because I just want everyone to be happy. And I think even as that person said it, they realised that in actual fact, spirituality can't be reduced to happiness, because in fact, even when we are filled with anxiety, when we are in the grasp of incredible grief, when we are experiencing loss in ourselves, when we are aging and losing our connections with people and our relationships, even then we are human and we are spiritual. So this whole business can't be reduced to happiness or the quest for happiness or being happy. You can hear how the irreducible begins in us the process of questioning. So if it's not about being happy or being well, if it's not only about those things, what is it about? What does it mean to be spiritual? Where is God when there is suffering and when there is loss, grief, and the tortuous anxiety of being human? So these situations throw us into a position of realising that we are mystery, we are irreducible. We are thrown from the certainty of logos, of knowledge, into the concern of theos. So theos, mystery, is not. It's not confusion. It is concern. We are delivered from the realm of certainty across the border into the realm of doubt. Now you may be asking me, even as I say that, hang on, Chris, how can doubt possibly have a role to play? Because isn't doubt related to confusion? Well, I would suggest to you that obviously some forms of doubt are related to confusion, the inability to decide or to understand one way or the other. But there are other ways to understand doubt. It is this place of doubt in us, as we observe reality with sober reflection, that lies at the heart of all research, not only theological research, but all research. It is the forge of inquiry. When we realise that we don't know, or that we can't reduce, or that our knowledge is finding all kinds of questions, we are moved into a place of concern for what is true in this situation. We begin to doubt our previous reductions, our previous ways of bringing our understanding into form. We can feel often the desire to avoid this process in ourselves. It's when we're avoiding that we become clingy to our forms, our understandings, our ways of describing things that we're familiar with. We insist on reductionism and worldviews that hold to rigid understandings of sacred text or tradition, to rigid understandings of context, what is socially right or what is culturally right, and to rigid understandings of reason that are not open to change and exploring. It's these ways, these forms of reductionism that we cling to when we resist doubt, when we resist the way doubt opens us up to inquiry, because it can be a pretty scary process to consider that we may have misunderstood, or that our understandings may be limited, and that in fact new experience exposes us to new ways of understanding, to new approaches to truth. When we cling, we run the risk of being obsessed with irrelevant commentary about what is no longer relevant or true. It is the questions that we encounter in our experiences, our encounters with others, our interactions with reality, that actually matter in this process of staying close to what is true. Tony Kelly, a wonderful Catholic theologian from Melbourne, so eloquently stated the importance of context and openness to encounters with real situations and real human beings when he wrote, "There is nothing so ridiculous as the answer to an unasked question." The answer to an unasked question. And it's when church communities spend a lot of time, religious communities rather, spend a lot of time on questions that are no longer relevant to the wider society, that we start to suspect that those church communities might be a little bit out of step with where truth is. For theology seeks to bring understanding into mediating conversation with the irreducible, and the irreducible comes to us when we pay attention to experience and context and situation. The awareness of the irreducible element is compelling in my view, and once we are truly aware of it and open to it, we cannot proceed naively without it. Both the awareness of the irreducible element and the inquiry that emerges from that awareness is only possible with the presence of a crucial inner stance that can truly be called a spiritual attitude that we bring to the theological conversation. The spiritual attitude that creates the conditions that make true inquiry possible is called the kenotic descent, and that's something that I've said in the past. Kenotic, kenosis, is an ancient Greek word that occurs once in the New Testament in the Philippians hymn, the letter to the Philippian church, chapter 2. It reads in this way. The part that relates to kenosis reads in this way. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, and that's the word kenosis, emptied himself, and it's related to humility. Taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, and being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. What I want you to notice is the direction away from transcendence towards the complex messiness of humanness. Descent is, of course, a spatial metaphor that relates to ancient tiered understandings of the cosmos. For our purposes, it reveals a surprising spiritual direction that is not always apparent in religious teleology. Teleology means the study of goals or aims, and religious worldviews are often teleological in that they aim for something at the end of history or beyond history. Kenosis is the spirit of humility that risks letting go of the current form of things in order to descend into the complexity of uncertain, irreducible reality. And we see the picture of the Christ in Philippians 2 doing precisely that, letting go of the current form of things described in that passage as divinity and moving towards, or in that picture, descending into complex human existence that involves even death. It is the welcoming of the loss of naivety when confronted with the irreducible element of real life that is so important here. Once we are aware of the complexity of the irreducible nature of human beings, we cannot proceed without it. If we try and pretend that it isn't there, then we run the risk of looking naive. But in fact, we can no longer be said to be naive in a modernist secular society. Secularism means awareness of the other, awareness and mutual respect of the other view, the other opinion, the other understanding, the other experience. And so we willingly come into conversation with those experiences. I think descent is an apt metaphor in light of the strong tendency in some theologies and some Christian and other religious worldviews towards ascent, which can be described as the movement of transcending complexity through the determined attachment to form. In the Philippians picture of the mind of Jesus as the Christ, the divine direction, as I've said, is not towards transcendence of the complexity of human existence. On the contrary, the divine direction is towards descent into the midst of the complexity of existence. It is this kenotic descent in the mind of Christ that characterises theological inquiry and indeed the research that follows from it. So the challenge and the invitation to you as you watch this and try and make sense of what I'm saying is to take the encounter that you have with the other seriously and to bring that encounter into reflective conversation with your reasoning, with your tradition, with your sacred text, and ask what it means for our understanding of the world and human beings and of their interaction with the source of all life, the ground of being, the divine, God. What it means for how we listen, how we understand the other. Most importantly, what this whole theological conversation means for you as a person who is open to inquiry, who is open to change, changing your understanding of what is true, what is real, and what is essential and core to being a human being in the world. These seem like deep questions that are not particularly practical, but if you bring them in that cyclical pattern through action and reflection, through encounter, reflection, experience, reflection, then you begin to realise that asking these questions, making these questions part of your ultimate concern in life, is profoundly important for the way you practice, for the way you see the other human person, the way you listen to them, and how open you are to their experience of the world, to their way of making meaning, and to affirming them and enabling them to grasp and take hold of their own spiritual resources as they deal with their encounters with the world and themselves in the world, their own limitedness. You can hear, I think, how profoundly important these conversations are as we seek to listen to those who are living with a strong sense of their own ageing. For it's as we age, it's as we change, as our bodies change, as our cognitive functioning changes, as our levels of knowledge and wisdom change, that these questions become more and more pertinent for us, more and more conscious and present to us. And as listeners, we need to be open to the processes that are taking place in those that we're listening to. So you can tell, I think, that I haven't attempted in any way to tell you what to think about God or the world or other human beings in terms of our theological inquiry. I've invited you to consider a way of thinking, a way of knowing, a way of conversing with the world and with others that enriches and expands our theological understanding of the world. I really do look forward to our conversation on Wednesday. Go well.